while we're waiting for some people to join, um, thank you to the people who are already in here. This is the True Crime Talks Club, where we basically talk about all things true crime. We have different segments within the club. Some segments are dedicated towards specific stories. Um, and today we have Amara Cofer, who is the creator of Black Girl Gone. Before I get Amara to introduce herself a bit more, we have Danielle, who founded the club. Danielle, do you want to say anything?
No, I'm glad that Amara's here. I thank you, Bonnie, for also being here and everyone that's in the audience. And I hope that you all click the link at the top and make sure you download the Black Girl Gone podcast. Thank you.
Yes. Make sure you check it out. It's definitely one that's worth looking into. Okay, patience is not my virtue, so I can't wait any longer. I'm just gonna dive in. Amara, again, thank you so much for joining us. So when Danielle suggested that we sort of interview you, and she asked if I wanted to do it, and I was like, yes. Didn't even think about it because hello, Black Girl Gone, right? I can't say that I'm a true crime buff per se, but I get really passionate about stories that are particularly about people who look like me, because how can I not, right? And unfortunately, because I'm a Black woman, I realize, and I'm very sort of aware that if I went missing, unfortunately, probably the only people that would look for me are my loved ones, right? And no one else is really going to put up that much of a fuss. So, so I'm doing this for my own personal reasons because it's very close to home. I'm really excited to sort of carry on with the conversation. But what I'd like to hear from you, Amara, is where did the name come from? Obviously, Black Girl Gone is pretty self-explanatory, but is there a story behind why you chose that for a podcast?
So I would say that I did have like a really deep story about the name of the podcast. But I really don't. Obviously I came up with the name after coming up with the concept for the podcast. I knew that it was going to be about missing and murdered Black women and women of color. And I played with a few names when I was kind of in the very beginning stages of developing the podcast, and the Black Girl Gone, it stood out to me. It stuck out to me. I felt like it told it encapsulated everything that I wanted to say or convey about the show. Kind of in those three short words, like Black Girl Gone. So it wasn't like some connected to anything personal. It just, as soon as I kind of played around with a couple of different names, that one, it stuck out to me almost immediately. I really didn't even kind of go back and forth about it. I was like, as soon as I kind of put it down on paper, I was like, that's the one. That's it. So that's how I developed it.
It's perfect. It's a perfect name. Why Black girls?
Well, the genre of true crime is very, very popular, and it's becoming increasingly more popular. But like most things in America, it is dominated by stories of missing white women and murdered white women and white men. And our stories of missing Black women or murdered Black women are not the focus of these shows. And it's not that other true crime shows don't cover Black women or haven't covered stories of Black women, because they have, but it is not the focus of their shows. And I knew that as a Black woman and as a person who is a true crime fan, I'm a consumer of true crime. I knew that if I was going to do a podcast or focus on true crime in any way, then I was going to have to fill in that gap somehow. It's like, be the change you want to see in the world. Like, if you can't complain about the fact that there's no representation in a podcast and then start a podcast and not represent, the things that you feel like are not being represented. So it came from that. But bigger than that, what I saw was the impact that true crime has begun to have on cases. You know, cases that are covered by big podcasts, even like your Crime Junkies, or are featured in documentary films or documentary series. They get a lot of attention. And when you don't cover the stories of Black women, then that means that they're not getting that level of attention. And so outside of our stories not being told by the mainstream media, they're also not being left out of these conversations in the true crime genre. And so that leads to, you know, our cases not being solved, you know, our you know, Black women missing for, you know, exorbitant amounts of time, nobody even knowing about their stories, things like that.
Yeah. Do you remember, Amara, the first story that you ever covered?
Yes. So it was, I actually started the podcast, it'll be almost a year. We premiered our first 3 episodes on March 15th, 2021. And the very first episode that I covered was the story of Kiera Coles, who is a young woman who is missing from Chicago, Illinois. She was 3 months pregnant at the time that she was missing. She was a postal worker. And she's been missing since 2018. And when I started to kind of, you know, figure out, you know, who the stories I was going to cover, when I came across Kiera's story, I had heard about Kiera's story before, but I could not believe that she was still missing and that I had not heard anything about her story. You know, no true crime shows, no news media, and so I was baffled by the fact that, you know, there was no coverage of this missing pregnant woman, and so I knew I wanted to start with her story, and what happened to her, and try to give it some of that attention that I felt like it wasn't getting.
Yeah, and so you're doing the podcast, obviously. Did the podcast come before Black Girl Gone, or did Black Girl Gone come first? Did you decide that you wanted to cover stories of missing Black women and then land on the idea of a podcast, or not?
So the podcast, I guess it kind of came at the same time, I would say. I had been, you know, thinking about, you know, doing a podcast, you know, months before I started, and at the time I was working full time, and I just didn't have the time between, you know, kids and working. I knew that I wasn't going to have the time to dedicate to it. And then I ended up going through a transition with my employment in January of 2021. And I was like, okay, so this might be an opportunity for me to start this show. But I always knew from the beginning that it was going to be true crime, and that I was going to focus on the stories of missing Black women. I just, at the time when I started it, I had no idea that it was actually going to make an impact. I had no idea that people were going to listen to it. You know, none of those things went on my mind. I had no intention of it. You know, I didn't know that family members were going to be reaching out to me and asking me to cover their stories. I just thought it was going to be something that I did. And I was like, you know, if it works, if people listen to it, cool. If not, you know, then I'll take it from there. But almost immediately I started to see that what I saw, other people were seeing, which is that these stories are not being told, and that people were interested in these stories, and that the families of these women need somebody to tell their stories. They just want somebody to listen to them. They want to feel like somebody cares, because a lot of times they feel like nobody is caring about these stories, about their loved ones.
Yeah, exactly the point. I mean, so speaking of like the families and the stories that you decide to cover, how do you, obviously the topic, as you've mentioned, is a topic that unfortunately doesn't get a lot of coverage. So how do you find the stories? And when you find them, how do you decide which story is worth telling?
So it's really difficult because it's an overwhelming amount of stories, unfortunately.
Right.
So it's, you know, I'm constantly being sent stories through listeners or through people who follow me on Instagram. I mean, my inbox is every single day somebody is sending me a story of someone that I've never heard of.
Oh my
But
God.
yeah, it's actually, it's like I said, it's been overwhelming because I just, you know, you don't know it when you're not doing this work, or when you're not, you just kind of, and you don't see it, so it doesn't, you know, you don't think about it. But now I see it so much, and it's so hard to try to prioritize which stories to cover first and which ones need the most attention. But how I kind of ultimately decide is, you know, at the end of the day, because I am producing a podcast, I have to have a certain amount of information in order to tell the story, in order to bring the listener into the story. So a lot of times it is judged based on how much information is available about the story.
Right.
I have the ability to kind of, turn a small amount of information at least into a 25-minute episode. And if I can do that, if I can kind of dissect the information, I usually can do it really quickly and determine whether or not I can do a full episode. And then if I can't, I'll try to figure out another way that I can, amplify this information. Either I'll do a mini episode, or I'll share it on my social media channels, or make a TikTok video. I try to figure out another way to share it if I can't do a full, length episode about it. But yeah, and then in terms of like priorities, obviously if a family member reaches out to me, I try to prioritize those shows, because I've gotten, a family member that said, hey, please, my loved one is missing. Can you please do a story about them? So I prioritize those shows. But other than that, it's really just, I see the story, and it's a story that I want to cover. I use, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the website ourblackgirls.com. It's a really amazing website. Yeah, ourblackgirls.com is a website. The person who runs the website, she basically writes articles and collects all of this information about missing and murdered Black women. It's almost like a database of like articles and stories about these women. So you can go on ourblackgirls.com and find stories of a Black woman that you've never ever heard about. And it might not be a ton of information about it, but she does try to cover their story and acknowledge what happened to them. So I find a lot of stories on there as well, because it's just, it's a great resource for me to kind of find stories that are not, necessarily in their mainstream or easy to Google, things like that. So
yeah, so I'm listening to you speak, and obviously you've mentioned that family members have reached out to you. You've been almost overwhelmed by the number of stories that are out there that you didn't know about. Honestly, it just makes me really sad, to think about the fact that there are so many people out there that, like, human beings whose lives matter to, their family and friends, and, because they don't fit, I guess, the criteria that society tells us we should care about, they just slip under the radar and we never hear about them. I have an excerpt from one of your episodes. So this is episode 48, and I think it's the one that is talking about Raja.
Rachel Eichmann and
there you go.
Adriana Barnes.
Yeah. So that story, what got me when I was listening to that was at the end. I think it's her mum, Adriana Barnes's mum, is basically saying that she's not going to give up, and it just really touched me. So I'm going to play that out loud for everybody to hear.
Scene at Warner Road in Cleveland, Ohio, on July 30th, 2021. Adriana is 5'5" and weighs Adriana home. Am I doing it now? As of now, there has been no new information about Adriana's case, and it doesn't seem like the police are really doing much to find new information. Akua, however, will not give up until she finds her daughter and brings her home. Am I doing it now that I'm not going to stop until I find her? And I'm not going to quit, because if I quit, then who finds her? She matters to me. Until Adriana is brought home, she should matter to all of us.
So yeah, so that really touched me. Obviously, her mum is, not going to stop looking, as I would imagine most mums will never stop looking. But just that line of saying that she matters to me, it's heartbreaking. Nobody should go missing and not have the same level of attention given to them as other people, which kind of brings me to white woman syndrome.
Yeah.
And this is definitely something that I've heard you cover in your podcast, and it's been a massive topic of conversation, especially after the Gabby Petito case. How did you feel by the time that Gabby Petito went missing? It had been, you started your podcast, was it March last year, 2021?
Yeah.
Right. So by the time she went missing, I want to say it was late summer, if I'm not mistaken, that she went missing. That's probably, let's say, 6 to 7 months of you doing your thing with the podcast. How did you feel having all of these stories of, I don't know how many, multiple hundreds potentially Black women stories that you're going through, sifting through, can't find the information, you're talking to family members, and you're very involved in these stories because obviously you're reliving, you have to live the story to be able to tell it, right?
Yeah.
And then you see this woman who's gone missing, which, by the way, no one should go missing, right?
Exactly.
What happened to Gabby Petito absolutely should not have happened to anybody. But she has got the FBI, the whole world looking for her. And there are all of these women that you're just trying to find some information on Google on and you can't find. How did you process that?
Well, it was interesting because I started seeing, I'm on social media all the time, with my show, and and I started seeing the posts on Twitter at first, and then Instagram, and then TikTok. And then I started seeing it, and that's not abnormal because I follow a lot of true crime podcasters and people that are in that community. So I often see, a lot of people kind of sharing information like that. But then I started to notice that it was people that weren't in the true crime, weren't true crime podcasters, and it's starting to pick up speed. And then, of course, I started seeing it on CNN, and then it was just everywhere. And I didn't immediately have any feelings about it because it's so common, it's so typical for that to be the response when a young, pretty white woman goes missing. And so I didn't feel any immediate feeling about it. I was surprised, I would say, that the conversation around it immediately started being about the missing white woman syndrome and how America reacts to white women going missing. But it's, because I didn't think that America was going to have that conversation about this case because it's happened so many times. So I would say that surprised me. But in terms of the family members of the women that I cover, in Raja McQueen's and Audrey Barnes's case, they went missing in June and July of 2021. So before Gabby Petito went missing, these two young women were missing from Cleveland, Ohio, and nobody has ever heard their names. Right. And I think in one of the interviews, Raja's sister comments about it and how difficult it is for them to have their sister missing and have to watch the whole world looking for this one person and nobody knows their sister's name. So it's hard because I know that when the families of these women see this, that's what they think about. They think about, well, why isn't my daughter as important? Why isn't my daughter getting the FBI involved? Why isn't there a multi-state search for my child or my sister or my daughter? You know what I'm saying? It's just so yeah, so that was it was an interesting, like I said, I think the response was even more interesting because all of a sudden this conversation started to bubble up about missing white woman syndrome in a really broad, like a lot of people were talking about it. And it's I think that is the good thing that has come out of that conversation is that people are realizing that there is a disparity in the way that these stories are covered. There's Black women and women of color are not getting the same amount of attention, and we have to figure out why. You know what I mean? Just to kind of continue that. It's not just the media either, and I think that's the thing that we also have to reconcile with. At this point, it's not just the media. And there was a time where there was no social media, there was no Facebook, no Twitter, no TikTok, no Instagram. And so the media did have to kind of guess what people would care about, guess what would get ratings. Now they can just turn to social media and figure out what we care about, what we're talking about. I believe that's a big reason why the Gabby Petito case was even picked up by CNN, because how could they ignore it? How could they couldn't, everybody was talking about it on social media. It was everywhere. And so it becomes hard to ignore. And if we are not giving Black women of color, that same energy on social media, then yeah, it becomes less of a chance that then these mainstream entities are then going to pick up these stories. So, I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Actually, so one of the segments that I do on in the True Crime Talks Club is called Hidden Files, and what triggered that wanting to do that was actually the Gabby Petito case. Because at the time I discovered that there were about 700 or so, if I'm not mistaken, missing Indigenous women in the similar area to where Gabby Petito had gone missing. And I just couldn't process that there were almost 1,000 missing women in the same place, and no one was talking about it. It couldn't. It's like brain malfunction. I couldn't compute, you know. So that's why I was like, that's when I got into this, because I was like, yeah, no, like we need to, like you said before, be the change that you want to see. So yeah, I totally respect and relate with what you're saying. And I think, yeah, you're right. Like what we care about is what the media essentially cares about. So that does play a part. You mentioned the way that the families feel, and that's something that I definitely think about and have thought about. I can't even imagine how that must have felt for, the sisters, the mothers, the brothers, the uncles, the aunts, the friends of those women. Seeing, the whole world so focused on finding this one person.
Yeah.
And actually, there was somebody in one of your podcasts called Jasmine Smith.
Yes, that's my last episode. Yeah.
Yes. And I want to say it's her mother that's speaking, and again, broke my heart. So I'm going to play it just so everyone can hear.
Years, y'all. Come on now. Jasmine's mom posted a plea on her Facebook page. At that point, Jasmine had been missing for 2 years. She said this. Somebody knows something. It's been over 2 years, y'all. Come on now. Like, Jasmine didn't know. She's not a nobody. She's not a nobody. She's Jasmine. She's not a nobody. And if you know something, then I hope that God compels your heart. I hope that your guilt becomes so heavy that you have sleepless nights like me, that you can't go to sleep, that you toss and turn, and that you rest on your bed, that your nightmares get so bad they consume you. I pray that. Yes, I do. Because if you know something, I'm asking you to come forward. Jasmine is not a nobody. She's somebody's daughter. She's my daughter. She's somebody's sister. She's somebody's granddaughter, somebody's niece, somebody's friend, somebody, something. For Jasmine's family.
That was deep. And I think part of the reason why it's so deep is that people, and I was having a discussion about this with a fellow true crime talker / podcaster / clubhouse, I don't know what to call them, on Clubhouse, she's called Dr. Lunsford, and she does she covers like mostly like the dark history specifically in Black America, but she's sort of branching out to other areas. And we were talking about the way that in history Black people have always been dehumanized, and so listening to Jasmine's mother there saying she was a somebody, she was my daughter, she's a sister, she's a this and that, it's heartbreaking to have to remind the world of that. You know what I mean? Like that goes without saying. Like and the fact that I imagine that that's how the families of people feel. People who have missing daughters, because we're talking about missing Black women here. If you have a missing mother, a missing daughter, missing sister, a missing wife, you feel that this person should matter just as much as Gabby Petito. And that really touched me.
Yeah, and I believe that dehumanization of Black people, of Black women, it gives people, it creates this excuse, even if it's subconscious, that this person isn't as important, or I can't relate to this person, or we're not the same. And I remember like one of the things that I kept seeing when the discussion of missing white woman syndrome started to pop up around the Gabby Petito situation, people's defense of their kind of obsession with the case, or their sharing of the case, was that one of the things was like, oh, she was an influencer and she wasn't, and she was, she was somebody I could relate to. And, she reminded me of my daughter and she reminded me of my sister or my friend. And it's because we're seeing so much of her. We're seeing her parents talk about her. We're seeing people that are close to Gabby humanize Gabby to us. And so then it becomes like, oh yeah, well she's like my daughter. But if you don't do that for Black women, then you don't get the chance to see yourself in them. And it's like, if you strip away the fact that they're Black women, there are so many parts of these women that are related to every woman. Their mothers, their sisters, their daughters, their wives, their college students. They're all different. They're all along the spectrum. They're all different, all different things. They have a lot of different things going on. And so as a woman, whether you're Black, white, indigenous, we can relate to each other in some way. And so one of my goals in the podcast is that, or one of my, how I go about my podcast is that it is very much focused on these women. I want to tell their stories as much as possible. I want to try to include things about them and make you relate to them so that you care about them, not just the fact that they, not just the fact of how they were murdered or the details of how they went missing, because that's important to, the story. But I want you to know that these are real women. Like they had real lives, and and people are missing them, and people love them, and people cared about them, and people are looking for them. And so that's just like a really important thing that I focus on my show. It's not about trying to sensationalize these crimes and talk about every detail of the murder, and that's just not my style on my show, because I feel like there's enough dehumanization of these women even in their deaths. I try to bring that back to them in these stories, and make people aware and make people try to care about them.
Absolutely. Thank you for doing it. So I noticed a theme, and tell me if you've noticed this as well. With a lot of the cases, and maybe this is because they all happen to be missing, and a lot of them are cold cases now. What it seems like is there is a theme of women who they don't seem to they go missing under very I don't know what the word is I'm looking for. It doesn't seem to be like there's no evidence of foul play a lot of the time. So I'm thinking, for example, of I think her name is Ali Gilmore.
Yes.
Yeah, and I noticed a few of them where it felt like they've gone missing, but it's likely that whoever has hurt them is someone that they may have known, someone within their own community, which obviously is the worst, right? You don't want these things to happen, but if it's going to happen, you don't want it to be somebody that you know, you love, and you trust. So why I bring this up is obviously we've mentioned white women syndrome, or missing white women syndrome, sorry, and it's a thing, and I'm 100% a proponent of let's stamp that out. However, I do find that within our own communities, there's a conversation that's not being had about the fact that we're not looking after each other, right?
Yeah.
And so, is that a theme that you're noticing, or am I?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that most crimes are committed unfortunately by people that I think that most homicides are not random. I think there are obviously robberies and carjackings and things like that, but a lot of times people are murdered by people that they know, and a lot of times people that they love. And I think that if you look at most of the cases, and this is not something that you can ignore in the stories that I cover, even though it's not a focus of my show, most of the women that have been murdered or have gone missing, their proximity to a man or their involvement with a man has something to do with their death or them going missing. And I don't. The thing about my show is, like, I don't want my show to be controversial, because I feel like if I add too much controversy, it takes away from the purpose of the show, which is the women and their stories and their families. And so I don't try to add in a lot of, I don't bash the police on my podcast.
You don't want to get political.
Yeah, I don't get political. If there's things about the investigation that are obviously wrong, or the police, then I'm going to say that. But I'm not just going to give a lot of blatant opinions about the police. I don't focus on making it about men or, the patriarchy and things like that, because I want people to listen, and I want people to. I want to bring as many people in as I can to focus on these women. We can have political conversations in other forums, not within the show. But if you're a listener of the show and you follow the show, then yeah, that is most definitely a theme. And I think that I try to bring awareness to the fact that domestic violence is a real thing, and it affects so many of these women. So many of these women experience domestic violence at some point in their lives, and then ended up missing or ended up dead. And it is hard to ignore, and I do think that it's a conversation that we have to have. But it's a conversation that a lot of communities have to have, because if you look at a lot of cases of missing and murdered white women, they're murdered by their husbands or boyfriends. It's a domestic violence, situation. And I think that the conversation, has to be really focused on what is, why is this happening? What is the root cause of these situations, and how can we, you said look after each other. Yeah, how can we look after each other? Because the problem with domestic violence is that it's not always something that you can see. You know what I mean? It's not always a black eye. It's not always, broken limbs. Sometimes it's verbal. A lot of these women weren't being physically harmed. You know what I mean? Somebody wasn't beating on them necessarily, but they may have been controlling. They may have been verbally abusive. I mean, there's obsessive behavior, possessiveness, things like that. That's forms of domestic violence. So that if you're trying to leave him now, they say that that's the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence, is when they try to leave, because their abuser feels like they're losing control. So it's just it's a really difficult thing, but it's most definitely a theme of the show, and something that I see in most of the stories that I'm covering.
Wow, what an amazing conversation between Bonnie and Amara. But that was only part one. In part two, Amara sets the record straight on what the community can do to stand up more for missing Black women. She emphasizes the importance of not just relying on the media. So go watch the exciting conclusion, part two of this interview now. Subscribe to this channel, hit the notification for more new upcoming videos, and go subscribe and download the Black Girl Gone podcast today. Bye.